what if one of the most influential ideas in Protestant Christianity didn't actually come from the Reformation? What if it started with a first-century heresy? Well, that's the pretty controversial argument we're digging into today, as we trace a major Christian theology back to a very unexpected place.
Yeah, we're talking about Calvinism. It's a massive theological system, a real cornerstone of the Reformation. But this explainer is built around a pretty wild question. What if its core idea, predestination, has a much older and way more controversial origin story than most people think? So, to unpack all this, we're going to go on a bit of a historical detective journey. We'll start with an ancient Gnostic idea, see how it got revived by Augustine, and then how John Calvin picked it up during the Reformation. We'll also check out the major counterargument, decode the 5 key points of the debate, and finally, see how this whole thing is still playing out today. All right, so to really get this argument, we have to jump in our time machine and go all the way back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, to a spiritual movement that was happening right alongside early Christianity.
That movement was called Gnosticism. Now, the key Gnostic belief for our story, according to the source, is this. They taught that some people had souls that were literally divine sparks, little pieces of God. And because of that divine nature, those people were predestined to be saved, period. It was just a fact of who they were. Meanwhile, everyone else, well, they didn't have that spark, so they were predestined for destruction. And no choice or action on their part could ever change that.
So the author lays out this whole family tree for the idea. It supposedly starts with a group of Egyptian Essenes who mixed Jewish beliefs with paganism. Then it gets picked up by a guy named Simon Magus, who the early church called the father of the Gnostic cults. But the idea really gets written down and formalized around 150 AD by a Gnostic leader named Valentinus. He's the one who codified what we now call double predestination, this idea that some are literally born saved and others are born for hell. And this right here, this is a really crucial piece of the puzzle for the author's argument. Valentinus taught that if your salvation was already guaranteed because of your spiritual DNA, so to speak, then your actions, whether they were good or bad, were totally irrelevant to your final destiny. Your fate was a done deal from the moment you were born. Okay, so this whole Gnostic idea was condemned by the early church, and it mostly just faded away. But the author claims it didn't disappear for good. So let's fast forward about 300 years to one of the most influential thinkers in church history, Augustine of Hippo. And this is where things get really interesting. Check out this journey. According to the source, before he was a famous Christian, Augustine was actually a Manichaean for 8 years, and that's a Gnostic sect that believed in predestination. After he converted to Christianity, he completely flipped and started arguing for free will. But then he gets into this massive debate with a teacher named Pelagius, and the author argues Augustine swung way back to the other extreme, developing a Christianized version of predestination, an idea that looked a lot like the one he had supposedly left behind. And this chart just lays out the clash perfectly. On one side, you have Pelagius, saying humans are born neutral, totally able to choose good. On the other side, you have Augustine's later view, that humanity is so broken, so totally depraved, it can't even choose good. And if that's true, he argued, then salvation has to be predestined by God for some. It was a debate between two polar opposites. So who won? Well, according to the source, neither of them. The early church at the Council of Ephesus basically looked at both views and said, nope. They condemned Pelagianism, but they also rejected Augustine's hardline predestination. They landed on a middle path. Yeah, humans have a sin nature, but they still have the free will to accept or reject God's offer of salvation. And that middle ground, well, it pretty much held for 1,000 years, a whole millennium. But then the 1500s happened, and with them, the Protestant Reformation.
Now, this is where the source makes a really provocative claim about John Calvin's motives. It argues that Calvin, who was a trained lawyer, rediscovered Augustine's writings and saw a powerful tool. I mean, think about it. At that time, the Pope had ultimate authority. But what if a person's eternal fate was already sealed by God before the world even began? Well, then no earthly authority, not the church, not even the Pope, could change it. The author argues this theological idea became a kind of political weapon to shatter the absolute power of the papacy.
So you can probably guess that a big idea like this wasn't just going to go unchallenged, right? Of course not. In response to Calvin's teachings, a powerful counter-movement popped up, and it came to be known as Arminianism. And Arminianism was basically a point-for-point rebuttal. It put free will right back in the center. arguing that salvation is a genuine offer to everyone, and it's conditioned on a person's choice to accept it. In this view, Christ died for everybody, God's grace can be resisted, and it's even possible for someone to walk away from their faith.
All right, this brings us to where the rubber meets the road. This whole debate is famously summarized by the 5 points of Calvinism, which you might know by the acronym TULIP. So let's decode this theological showdown.
Okay, let's walk through this table letter by letter. We start with T for total depravity. The Calvinist view, humans are so broken, they're not even able to accept salvation. The Arminian view says, no, we can't save ourselves, but we can accept the free gift. Next, U for unconditional election. Does God choose people based on his own mysterious will, or does he choose them based on his foreknowledge of who would freely believe in him? Then we have L for limited atonement. This is a big one. Did Christ die only for the elect or for every single person? I stands for irresistible grace. If God calls you, do you have a choice, or is his grace impossible to resist? And finally, P for perseverance of the saints. Basically, once saved, always saved. Or do believers have to continue in faith?
So, to back up that Arminian idea of universal atonement, the author points to scriptures just like this one, from John. The text seems to say pretty clearly that Christ's sacrifice wasn't just for our group, but for the whole world. And here's another big one they cite from 1 Timothy. The argument here is simple. If God's will is for all men to be saved, how does that square with the Calvinist idea that the atonement was specifically limited to a pre-chosen group of elect?
Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all fascinating, but it's ancient history, right? Well, not so fast. This centuries-old debate is alive and well, and it profoundly shapes Christianity today.
So if you look at the landscape today, the author claims that while Calvinism is incredibly influential, the actual majority of Protestant denominations, think Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, tend to lean more towards Arminian theology. The really hardcore Calvinist theology is mostly found in churches with Reformed or Presbyterian in their name.
And just to prove this isn't some dusty old academic debate, the source points to a whole list of really influential modern teachers that it identifies as carrying on that Calvinist tradition. So these ideas are still being taught from major pulpits and in seminaries right now.
And this is where the author brings his entire argument full circle. He points to what he calls new-style Calvinists, who he claims take predestination to its most logical and extreme conclusion. It's this idea that, hey, if my salvation is absolutely guaranteed no matter what, then my personal holiness, how I live, whether I avoid sin, it doesn't really matter in the end. And that, the author argues, is a direct echo of that ancient Gnostic mindset we started with.
So after all that, we're left with the one question this whole historical argument really hinges on. Does the origin of an idea determine its truth? Even if this lineage is correct, does it automatically invalidate the theology? That's the question to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.